Africa's governance performance has worsened in 2019, and this is for the first time in nearly a decade. And that's due to a broad deterioration in the areas of human rights, security and the rule of law. These are the findings of the latest Ibrahim Index of African Governance. The survey is considered the most comprehensive of its kind on the continent. It rates 54 African nations against criteria including security, human rights, economic stability, free elections, corruption and poverty, amongst others. The 2019 African average score for the overall governance declined by minus 0.2 points from 2018, registering the first year-on-year score deterioration since 2010. Well, let's explore the issue of governance further with senior consultant for the Institute for Security Studies, Dr. David Zounmenou, who joins us via Skype. Thanks so much indeed for joining us. So this Ibrahim Index says that there's been a decline in the standard of governance across the continent. Does this come as a surprise to you?
Good evening, Peter. Good evening to the viewers. Not at all, because we've seen the trend actually in Africa for the past, I would say, 10 years. We are alternating between some kind of progress, but some kind of regression as well. You have some constants in countries like Mauritius, which remain steady in the way they approach governance, while you have other countries going further down. And this is not a surprise, because the way power is conceived in Africa has an impact on the quality of governance, have the impact on the quality of the response to security issues, to rule of law, to citizen participation. And I think this is becoming the space for citizens to have a say in the way their country are governed is shrinking every year.
So, I mean, the report says from 2015 there was already a decline, and it's only now that we've gone past the 2010 level. And I suppose these things don't happen overnight, but these alarm bells keep ringing. And yet we have institutions, we have treaties, we have everything that we need on the continent to manage these problems. Why aren't these things being enforced? Why aren't our governors being brought to book?
There are at least a number of factors. I want to say 4 or 5 factors that explain the decline in governance. It seems to me, I think we need to start with the kind of election that we are holding on the continent. I just came from West Africa, where I have to visit Guinea, Abidjan, Burkina Faso, and I'm heading to Niger. All those electoral processes are contentious because those who are governing have only one thing in mind: how to keep power, to be able to have access to resources, and forget to distribute only those resources to meet the needs of their citizens. And adding to that, the context of the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic that we are facing, where governance should be streamlined and improved to be able to alleviate the suffering of the majority of the people. In fact, it provides a tool in the hand of the government to restrict the freedom, to prevent citizens from knowing or questioning what is happening. Corruption has taken completely new dimension. Without any institution capable of calling to responsibility those who are leading us. In fact, it's become an instrument of patrimonial system which does not allow institutions to question. And those institutions themselves have been co-opted into the narrative to reinforce the power of those that are governing the country. The Constitutional Court is not independent. The tribunal, the justice system is not adequate. They are not really responding to do the job in terms of check and balance of what the executive is doing. So it seems that we talk about the third wave of democracy, we talk about improving the access to resources, but leaders keep on reinventing strategies to circumvent all the treaties, constitutions, normative institutional framework that we put in place, both at the national level, but also at the continental level, to bypass what is expected from them in terms of delivering public goods and excellent public good to the citizen.
You talk about elections. We've just had an election in Tanzania. Many people say that the president there had put too much force in terms of silencing the media, making it difficult for the opposition to campaign. And I spoke to election observer Pansi Tlakula last week, and she was less than impressed with this election compared to the last one. And so the question then becomes, the East African community was there to observe this election. Why did they give these elections the thumbs up when they fall short of norms and standards?
I think that's a challenge that we need to overcome, and that's particular is not peculiar to the East African community. It's almost everywhere. With the economic community of West African state or the biggest institution, the African Union, we have the same issue, because they look at those processes as a political rubber stamp exercise for the government, which is not supposed to be the case, because they have clear guidelines to assess whether those elections reflect the proper will, the real expression of the will of the citizen. The trend that we are observing, Peter, over the past 5 years is that the incumbent government would deploy all efforts to co-opt, as I said earlier, the electoral monitoring bodies, to reduce the space for civil society activities, to put journalists into prison or to prevent them from doing their job, to simply redefine the rule of the game, particularly the electoral laws, to exclude a very important part of the population that's not favorable to their ideology out of the electoral world. And even if you have external observers, particularly from African regional communities, they don't do a good job to really declare what is on the ground, what's happened on the ground. And this is because they came to the country only a week before the election takes place most of the time. And when everything is set, the government has already created the scene for them to see that, look, everything is okay. So you just write your report, sign your report, and go. While the real critical question remains the linking between the people and the government in terms of calling, making sure that accountability here is held up and used as a criteria to punish or reward any leaders who want to get to power.
All right, and you're talking about silencing of journalists' voices. We're seeing it happening in Zimbabwe, we're seeing it happening in Eswatini and other parts of the continent. But one disturbing trend, and I guess this is a consequence because the citizens are expecting much, much more now, is that you end up with post-election violence. You end up with protests in Nigeria where the authorities then clash with citizens. Will we see more of this as the governance index decreases even further?
That's a real concern, Peter, what you just mentioned. In all the 5 or 6 elections that we are going to have from now until December, we are going to expect incidents of electoral violence, simply because of a disagreement between the way and the quality electoral processes present to the citizen, but also because of a lack of avenue for citizens to hold accountable, to ask for responsibility of their leaders. Cote d'Ivoire is just going through a very difficult time now. Guinea was initially, at the beginning of last month, embroiled in a violent protestations. Nigeria, as you mentioned. So many countries, many citizens are saying, because all avenues are closed, the only thing that remains for us is the street. But to get to the street, you also have to make sure that the security forces are not used to repress for people. And that's where we have a big question. The same security forces who cannot defend the territories of their countries against Islamist groups or terrorist groups can find the resources and the strength to repress citizens who are asking for good governance, fair distribution of goods, access to education and to health care. I think there is a paradox in this process that we need to discern. This is time for African Union to really hold on to what they call the African governance architecture, which is the blueprint that they put in place to steer the government, to improve the governance process on the continent.